Nathan Hayes stood at the edge of what used to be downtown Chicago, his worn boots sinking slightly into the cracked asphalt as the wind swept through the hollowed-out skeletons of skyscrapers. The city was nothing more than a graveyard now. The once bustling streets were covered in a thick layer of ash, remnants of fires that had burned for weeks after the alien bombardment. What little life remained on Earth struggled in the shadow of extinction, but Nathan had learned to find peace in the desolation. A soft hum in the distance broke his reverie. He looked up, squinting against the overcast sky. His enhanced vision, a gift from years of military augmentation, saw the faint outline of a spacecraft, a relic from the war. It wasn't moving like it was under attack. Instead, it seemed to be slowly drifting toward the ruins of the city, almost aimlessly. Nathan's heart tightened, his body tensing with the instinctual readiness of a soldier. But the feeling quickly passed. He had already done his part. The aliens were gone, scattered across the stars, or so the last reports claimed. Earth had won. Or had it? He pushed the thought aside, the memory of his last battle still too fresh. His mind lingered on the battlefield, on the faces of the soldiers he had led into the final strike against the alien mothership. The victory had been hard-won, but it hadn't been enough to stop the scars it left on the planet. And on him. Why am I still here? Nathan muttered to himself, his voice rough like gravel. It was a question he'd asked 1,000 times since the war ended. His comrades were dead. The world was broken, and humanity had claimed its victory, but it felt hollow. He took a deep breath, savoring the rare quiet. He wasn't hunting any longer, wasn't a soldier in the trenches. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to rest. The war might be over, but the ghosts of the past would follow him. The galaxy had never anticipated humanity's rise. When Earth's first colonies began spreading across the stars, the alien civilizations watched with a mix of confusion and mild amusement. How could a species that had only just learned to travel beyond their own moon pose any threat? The larger empires who had flourished for millennia saw the humans as a passing curiosity, destined to burn out quickly in the face of true intergalactic power. They were wrong. At first, the war of the first wave had been a series of small skirmishes. Outposts lost, colonies raided. But then, something unexpected happened. The aliens discovered Deathworlders, soldiers born of Earth's savage and unforgiving nature, genetically modified and trained in environments where only the strongest survived. These warriors were not like any the galaxy had seen before. They didn't just fight. They adapted. They thrived. Nathan Hayes had been part of that first wave of soldiers sent to reclaim human colonies overtaken by the alien forces. His training on Earth had been grueling. Endless drills in toxic jungles, under scorching suns, in frozen wastelands, where the cold could freeze a man's bones in minutes. That brutal survivalist edge made him something more than human. He wasn't just resilient, he was relentless. Every battle, every mission, had sharpened him into a weapon honed by a planet that demanded its children never give up, never surrender. By the time the war escalated into full-scale conflict, Nathan had led raids against alien forces so powerful they were thought invincible. His name became a curse whispered in the halls of enemy command centers. Hayes, the Reaper, death incarnate. Humanity's war machine was fueled by these Deathworlders, and the aliens quickly realized their mistake. They underestimated the fire that burned in every human heart. The galaxy had a new terror. Humans didn't just survive. They'd fought until there was nothing left to fight. But as the tide turned, the cost became unbearable. Worlds were shattered. Entire species wiped out. Earth herself had been scared by every blast, every crater, every drop of blood spilled. Humanity had won the war, but at a price they would never fully be able to pay. Now, Earth was a broken shell of its former self. Nathan trudged through the remnants of the old world, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the last traces of the setting sun flickered behind the scorched sky. The air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and charred wood, the lingering scent of a planet trying, but failing, to heal. Yet, amid the ruins, there were signs of life. Small, fragile, but real. As he approached the valley, a sense of something different hit him. The land here had been untouched by the worst of the war. No alien bombardments, no trenches dug into the earth, no craters to mar the landscape. It was green, lush in places, though still scared by the planet's long scars. Humans had been living here for months, perhaps years. They had found something that Nathan hadn't thought was possible anymore. Peace. The survivors of the war had created a small, tight-knit community, sheltered in the hills away from the chaos of the cities and the wreckage left by the alien forces. A handful of farms dotted the valley, and the smell of freshly harvested crops filled the air. It was a modest existence, simple, even, but it was a world apart from the desolation that had consumed the rest of the planet. Nathan passed a group of children playing in the fields. They barely glanced at him, too absorbed in their games. To them, he was just another man, a man with scars. Sure, but not the myth that his name had once carried. The people here had no need for heroes. They were surviving, rebuilding, carving out a life from the ashes of war. A woman with short, curly hair approached him, a hesitant but welcoming smile on her face. Her name was Hannah, one of the leaders of this small enclave. "You're Nathan Hayes, right?" she asked, her voice soft, though tinged with awe. He nodded slowly but didn't speak at first. What could he say? He wasn't here to be a hero. He wasn't even sure what he was here for anymore. "You're welcome to stay with us," she added, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "We could use a strong hand." Nathan looked out over the valley, at the people who had somehow managed to piece together a life from the shattered world. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't anger or fear. Maybe peace. It felt wrong to even think it. He wasn't sure he could rest, but for the first time in a long time, he considered it. Days passed, then weeks. Nathan found a rhythm in the valley, a strange kind of routine that seemed almost alien to him after years of war. He helped rebuild houses, cleared rubble from old structures, and even helped mend broken tools. He'd never thought of himself as anything but a soldier, a weapon forged in Earth's brutal crucible. But here, with these quiet, resilient people, he started to feel something he hadn't in a long time. Purpose. Not the purpose of war, but of living. Yet, peace, it seemed, was always fleeting. The evening of the third week, Nathan stood alone at the edge of the valley, gazing at the horizon. A storm had been brewing all day, the air heavy with the promise of rain, but it wasn't the weather that caught his attention. It was the distant hum. At first, Nathan thought it might be some trick of the wind, the shift of broken structures in the distance, but it persisted, growing louder. His senses, honed from years of battle, went on high alert. The deep, throbbing hum was unmistakable now. A ship's engine, not just one, but several. He turned quickly, scanning the valley. There was no way the ships could have just appeared unnoticed. This wasn't a surprise. The community had been too focused on rebuilding, too naive in its belief that the worst had passed. He could already see the faint silhouettes in the sky, alien vessels, low and menacing. Their forms were sleek and angular, their colors blending with the gray clouds, making them almost invisible unless you were looking for them. Nathan's stomach tightened. He felt the old reflexes stirring, ready for war, for survival. The fight had come to him again. He was no longer the man who could rest on the sidelines, no longer the weary veteran wishing for peace. He was a Deathworlder, and if these invaders thought they could bring another war to his doorstep, they were gravely mistaken. "Everyone," Nathan shouted, his voice carrying over the valley. "We have incoming. Get to shelter. Now." The air seemed to crackle with tension. The people around him, too many of them still too new to this world of constant danger, froze in fear. They didn't yet understand what he meant, but Nathan could already see it in their eyes. The nightmare was back. The alien ships descended slowly, methodical, almost surgical in their approach. There were at least 6 of them, large, segmented craft that gleamed in the fading light like predatory insects. They were no longer the hulking brute force warships Nathan had fought against in the past. These ships were sleek, efficient, designed for precision. The new enemy wasn't here for a massacre. They were here for something else. Something darker. The valley was already in motion. The survivors scrambled, some shouting orders, others simply running. Children were hustled into bunkers, women and men alike gathering weapons. Not that they had much to fight with. Most had never seen war up close, only heard the stories, the horrors Nathan had left behind. Nathan stood in the middle of it all, his eyes scanning the skies, calculating. He was no longer just the soldier of a war long past. He was the last line of defense, the shadow of humanity's war machine. He felt the weight of it again, the responsibility, the rage, and a haunting weariness that never left him. The first ship touched down at the edge of the valley, a low thud that seemed to shake the very earth beneath him. A ramp extended from its belly, and figures began to emerge, tall, with angular bodies and hard, featureless faces. Their armor was a matte black, reflective in places, and their movements were eerily synchronized, almost too perfect. They didn't look like the alien invaders from the past. These weren't the mindless soldiers who had ravaged Earth. These were professionals, hunters. Nathan's hand went instinctively to the sidearm he kept for years, the weapon's familiar weight grounding him. But he didn't draw it. Not yet. These invaders were probing, testing, looking for weaknesses, and he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing fear. Hannah, breathless, approached him. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Prepare for the worst," Nathan said grimly, his eyes locked on the approaching aliens. "We're not just going to survive. We're going to make sure they remember us." The air was thick with tension as the first shots were fired. Nathan was already in motion, running toward the front line of the valley with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. The first shots rang out like thunder, breaking the fragile peace of the valley. The survivors, mostly civilians, a handful of farmers and engineers, fired from whatever cover they could find. Overturned carts, the wreckage of old vehicles, and the few stone walls still standing. Their aim was wild, but the determination in their eyes was clear. They were terrified, but they weren't going to roll over. Nathan had given them that much. Nathan, though, moved like a shadow, silent, lethal. His mind clicked into battle mode as the first alien soldiers advanced, their smooth black armor reflecting the last light of the setting sun. These weren't the clumsy invaders of old, the ones who had underestimated humanity's resolve. No, these aliens moved with precision, their movements studied and purposeful, as if they'd been trained for this exact moment. They were hunters, not conquerors. Nathan took cover behind an old building, peeking around the corner to assess the situation. The aliens were pushing forward, using their advanced technology to scan the surroundings. Some of them were already deploying drones, small, insect-like machines that zipped through the air, sending waves of pulsing energy toward the defenders, knocking them off their feet. The drones didn't kill outright, but they incapacitated, paralyzed. The aliens wanted prisoners, not corpses. Nathan's heart pounded. He knew these tactics. He'd seen them before in other wars, against more brutal enemies. These were no simple raiders. Whoever these aliens were, they were smarter, more methodical. They had a clear goal, and it wasn't just to destroy. They wanted something far worse. Information, resources, maybe even humans. He turned back to the village. "Hannah," he shouted, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Get everyone underground. This isn't just an invasion. This is something else. They're not here to kill. They're here to capture." Hannah nodded, her face pale but resolute. "What do we do? How do we fight them?" Nathan's eyes locked on the approaching enemy. His grip tightened around his weapon. We fight like we always do, on our terms." He gave her one last glance before he sprinted toward the front lines, his mind already working on a plan. The valley was small, but the terrain could give them an advantage. He just had to keep them from realizing they were walking into a trap. Nathan's gut churned. Whatever these aliens were after, they would soon learn that Earth's warriors didn't surrender. Not anymore. The alien advance was unrelenting, but Nathan had expected nothing less. These invaders were no longer the mindless conquerors he'd once faced. Their tactics were sharp, calculated, practical, even. They'd come to Earth for a reason, and Nathan was sure it wasn't just for a fight. It was something deeper, something darker. The way they moved, the way they systematically disabled the humans' defenses, told him they weren't here to conquer or destroy. They were here to hunt. And Earth's warriors weren't the prey. Nathan ducked behind an old, half-collapsed building as an alien soldier passed by. His pulse was steady. Years of combat had taught him patience, the patience to wait for the perfect strike. A low hum filled the air as one of the alien drones hovered overhead, its mechanical limbs twitching as it scanned the ruins for movement. Nathan held his breath. Every muscle in his body tensed. The drone passed him without noticing, its sensors failing to detect him in the shadows. "Now," he whispered to himself. In a blur of motion, Nathan leaped from cover and fired. The drone erupted in a flash of light as his shots found their mark, knocking the tiny craft from the air. The explosion sent a shockwave through the area, throwing debris in every direction. But Nathan didn't pause. He was already moving again, slinking into the shadows, his mind calculating the next step. The valley was beginning to feel like a trap. The aliens were coming, but they were slow, methodical. They'd set up a perimeter, and it wasn't just about them pushing forward anymore. They were waiting for something, for a response, for something they knew was coming. Nathan reached the makeshift command center, where the remaining survivors had gathered, and found Hannah crouched next to a map, her brow furrowed in concern. "They've got us surrounded," she said, her voice grim. Nathan's eyes scanned the horizon. Not for long. "We're not done yet." The realization hit him with chilling clarity. This wasn't just about fighting for survival. The aliens weren't just trying to break the human spirit. They were trying to capture it. They weren't after resources or even revenge. They were after humanity itself, its strength, its resilience. And Nathan knew one thing above all. They would never break him. "Let's give them a reason to remember why they never should have come," he said, his voice cold with resolve. And for the first time in years, Nathan felt the familiar, bitter thrill of battle rise within him. He wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting to protect the soul of humanity. The battle raged through the night, the sky painted with flashes of weapons fire, the air thick with the acrid scent of smoke and burning metal. The alien forces had pushed into the valley with terrifying precision, but Nathan's tactics, hit and run, guerrilla warfare, had kept them at bay. For every inch they gained, they lost a dozen soldiers to the traps and ambushes Nathan and the survivors had set up. But the price was high. The valley's defenders had dwindled. The weapons they'd scavenged from old military stockpiles were running low. And still, the aliens came, their relentless advance seemingly unstoppable. Nathan was a storm in human form, moving from one position to the next, his armor soaked in sweat and blood, his eyes dead set on the enemy. The fight had become a blur of chaos, but through it all, there was a singular focus: survive. Protect the survivors. As dawn broke, the alien forces faltered. They'd underestimated the human will to fight. But as Nathan surveyed the battlefield, his heart sank. The survivors had held their ground, but at a terrible cost. The valley was littered with the bodies of the fallen. The quiet after the storm was suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of alien engines retreating into the sky. Nathan stood alone in the middle of the wreckage, his chest heaving, his rifle slung over his shoulder, but his mind numb with exhaustion. The enemy had retreated, but the victory felt hollow. He hadn't just lost soldiers, had lost friends, people who'd trusted him to protect them. He looked down at the body of Hannah, who had been one of the last to fall, her eyes still open in a silent plea for survival that had never come. He dropped to one knee beside her, his hand hovering over her forehead. There was no glory in this war, no honor, just an endless cycle of violence. But as he closed her eyes, he made a silent promise. This will end. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it will end. The battle was over, but Nathan knew the war was far from finished. There would always be another fight, another enemy. But for now, for this moment, he allowed himself to rest. His body was broken, but his spirit, humanity's spirit, remained unyielding. With a final glance at the sky, Nathan stood, his resolve unshaken. The war might never truly end, but as long as he drew breath, Earth would stand.